AI has quickly become a boardroom priority. As organizations shift from experimenting to embedding it in everyday work, the conversation is no longer just about the models and the algorithms. It's about building an enterprise operating system that enables AI to make reliable decisions, redesigns how work gets done, aligns business and technology teams, and ultimately delivers measurable business outcomes. In this episode of the Revenue Lounge, we'll explore what it really takes to scale AI across the enterprise. And joining me today is Amrutha Suresh. She is the head of go-to-market and AI innovation transformation at Asana. With a background spanning AI strategy, enterprise transformation, product innovation, and cross-functional leadership, she brings a practical perspective on turning AI from isolated pilots into a sustainable business capability. Amrutha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Excited to share my perspectives. I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, and this is a really special episode of the Revenue Lounge because I shared this with you in the green room. This is our 100th guest of the recording, so very pleased to have you, and specifically around a topic that I think is near and dear to many people. So I usually like to start these episodes with just asking a general question, which is maybe you can walk us through a little bit about your career background or journey and what led you to your current role at Asana, and what is your remit?
Yeah, I've been about 15 years in tech, specifically on the B2B software business. Come from a systems background. I've led technology teams, created product functions within the go-to-market organizations. With the AI boom, I pivoted to basically run a very small part of innovation, where we think about how do we identify opportunities that truly matter to the business and create value through AI and technology. So that's the pod that I'm running currently at Asana. While I've been doing all of this, I also did my MBA at Berkeley Haas, which kind of changed my perspective on how do I look at the business overall. So super excited to see what's going to come with all of this cool stuff that we're building.
Yeah, and so how long have you been specifically focused leading the AI?
Yeah, it's going to be about a year since we started this. We were doing this as a side gig, but it became so important that we decided to actually have a focused group that is working and building things in a very streamlined manner.
In what areas of the business does that hub encompass? I'm assuming you probably have leadership and maybe different functional leaders. I'd be curious to understand how you guys are designing that hub today.
Yeah, so initially we started off thinking about this more of an enterprise AI transformation, where this function reported on to the CIO of the company, where we were looking at pockets of AI innovation that's happening across the function, and then more of a AI council where we were governing how things are happening, what are some of the cool stuff that is being built out, the pilots. And then we started making this as a mandate where this became a company-wide goal of AI transformation is important, and here's what we want to be achieving with doing all these cool stuff. And then what happened was we started putting our focus more towards the revenue side or the go-to-market side of things. And that's where I moved from the CIO org to the revenue organization, leading a GTM AI transformation pod, which has a product management layer and also an engineering layer. Because if you think about the GTM tools, tech, and AI sort of area, there is a third-party tool that is mostly a buy-in and implementation, which was the standard GTM technology prior to the AI boom. And there is an in-house build, which typically is more around the proprietary context, data, and how you train your models, and then also make it more connected in terms of the architecture. And how do you evolve from a single agent to a multi-agent play? So that is basically the AI pod that focuses on the aspect of more in-house build.
Got it. Very, very good. I wanted to ask you a question because there's just so much, I think, experimentation going on inside of organizations, right? Everybody's running pilots or POCs. There's pockets of things maybe before they establish it, something like an AI council. And there's a lot of research out there. I think I might have heard you a presentation or podcast you gave about a month ago talking about how the majority of enterprises struggle to get out of the pilot mode or the POC mode, and only about 26% of them move beyond that. From your perspective, what do you think are the biggest reasons why some of these initiatives lose momentum after the initial pilot or POC?
Yeah, before actually answering the question, I do want to say that we got to be thinking of encouraging our teams and our companies to actually drive more innovation. What I'm trying to say here is we got to be building that pipeline of innovation ideas, because AI should be democratized and it should really be like a bottoms-up motion. What needs to happen is we need to have a very clear framework of what actually graduates from a pilot to a production grade capability. There is a difference in somebody vibe coding a very cool idea using Claude, using Codex, or any other cool AI capability, on their computer versus 1,000 people team running the same capability at scale. So I think that's the difference, and that is basically the framework we gotta have. When I say you gotta have a system of graduating pilots to production. I think some of the biggest challenges we encounter when you take one person's sort of a capability and make it more production grade is how do you address concerns around security, permissions, data becomes a really, really important thing. So you got to think about the different edge cases, business rules, integration dependencies. So these are some of the constraints that you meet when you start taking in this white coded sort of an app from a single person's computer or desktop into more of a production grade system, right? Another issue that I also see is that the pilots are typically started as an interesting technology and I want to get my hands on it rather than an important business problem that I want to go solve after. So you get all of this adoption traction during the novelty phase, but I think it's really important for it to stick. You got to think about what does this mean in terms of the outcome for my business? Is this important enough that I'll be talking to my leadership about and be able to measure and show the results? So really thinking this through from an outcome lens and then all the constraints and dependency to make this a production grade, these would be like the two considerations I would have at a high level when you think of taking in a pilot or an innovation project and making it truly production grade. Another thing that I also want to touch upon is the ongoing maintenance, because if you think about the build versus buy, which is a very spicy topic in the community, there are companies that exist which are very purpose-built for a specific reason, right? So you don't have to invest your resources for ongoing maintenance. Yeah. Yes, we do incur costs with building AI, right? There's LLM token cost, etc. But you also got to think about what does it take for us to maintain this as a product? Because this is not a one and done. You got to be running optimizations. You got to be releasing features, continuous improvements. So that's like an invisible sort of a hidden cost. So you got to be factoring all of these things when you actually say that this is something I want to take as a side project or a cool innovation idea and make it a production grade system. You really got to have this R&D mindset when you think about AI transformation on how do you productize everything and also maintain that ongoing.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is any sort of multi-motion or multi-function AI initiative that truly is enterprise touches a lot of stakeholders and a lot of departments. And I think any sort of digital business transformation, there's a change management component to that, right? And maybe some internal politics that you have to work around. How do you approach that? What are some of the watch-outs that you look for to make sure that you've got that right organizational alignment?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because one of the things that I've learned while I've been doing all of the AI transformation at Asana is AI transformation, unlike other things that we've seen, breaks the traditional organizational boundaries very quickly. So what I mean by that is you gotta be bringing people along in the journey very early. So think about your stakeholders. Once you identify them, they have to be treated as design partners from the very beginning. Right? Whether it's security, whether it's legal, whether it is enablement, especially when you think about go-to-market transformation, it has to stick with the field because they have been bogged down with so many changes in multiple directions. This cannot be yet another change. And also the AI transformation should not be designed as another system implementation. For me, when I think about an AI capability, it's a complete redesign of how work happens. For that, enabling them and making sure it sticks is going to be really important. So enablement partners are going to be a huge, I would say, lever in making this. So bringing them early on and making sure that they have a shared responsibility and also everybody's working towards the shared business outcome is going to be extremely important. And that's a lesson that I learned in a hard way to make sure that I identify who are the people who matter to make this moving, make anything moving and make this stick. And bringing them along as design partners together with a shared outcome is going to be super, super important.
Yeah, wonderful. There's something you touched on earlier that I wanted to dig in a little bit more on, which is everyone talks about the importance of context. Context is really a hot topic right now around designing AI into transformation. And I think where people maybe stop short is understanding what context really means, because there's several different types, right? There's activity context, which is like what happened. There's relationship context, which is who is this connected to or what is it connected to, right? There's knowledge context, like product specs and security docs and architectural diagrams. And then there's semantic context, which is the business context. What is the shared definition or shared understanding? So I'd love to unpack that a little bit with you in terms of how do you think about the different contracts, and does one play a more important role than another, and how do you design for all those?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because one of the things when I started doing all of this, the first thing and the biggest challenge we had is, before even getting to the context, it was the underlying data foundations, right? Just like any technology program, data is a very foundational component to it, because garbage in equals garbage out. So
Yep.
one, we started off with thinking through what does like good data hygiene looks like for the specific type of capability that we want to deliver. I think what we also realized in that process is, I don't think AI ready means we should have a perfectly clean data, right? AI ready is your data is usable in the context of a decision for your organization. So we have this data foundation layer, and then we have on top of that, think about this, it's a more layered architecture is what I'm talking about. So data foundations, and then you have the semantic layer, to your point, which is basically the context of the definitions and standardized way of looking at certain business components of your data layer. So a customer, for example, could be very different for a sales versus what a marketing is addressing as a customer. And a field called, let's say, engagement may mean something completely different for sales, marketing, and product. So in order for AI to work well, AI needs a common definition of the concepts that matter to the business. So that's where we started building out semantic layer on top of our data foundations. So raw data might tell us that, for example, someone logged into the product like 70 times. But what a semantic layer would tell me is that this is a high intent user in a strategic account whose usage pattern resembles a customer that historically has expanded. So that is the insights that a semantic layer is gonna basically give me. Now, imagine asking AI, should I prioritize this account, right? Knowing the company size and industry would just not be enough, right? It might need more information that it needs to be bolstered on, like usage of the product or your product telemetry, past opportunities, conversations with customers, who is involved in your buying committee, what is your company's ICP definition, rules, what are some of the current strategic plays in motion. So there's multiple other data it has to connect to make that profile. So this is what I think about as the context assembly layer. So essentially you have your data foundations, then you have your semantic, which is basically standardizing your definitions across the company that you work for, and then having the context where basically it turns the things into like a meaningful sort of a business concept. And then for each decision, you can dynamically assemble the context that is relevant for that specific use case or the agent that you want to build. So I look at it in a 3-tiered architecture on which the application agents basically sit. And I think the most important thing that we're trying to think of and evolve is, how do we make this sort of an architecture more composable? Because we want to start building everything so quickly, we don't want to have the pipelines rebuilt, right? Like the underlying foundations for the agent. Each time we don't want to be replicating or rebuilding that. We want to really have the standardized sort of a data layer and make our application agents more composable in a way which can be basically referencing the same underlying data components, but very quickly we should be able to layer in like multi-agent sort of a capability in a very composable way.
So the architecture that you described that sort of brings in all the different contexts, is there a owner, like who owns that sort of context piece? Is that a single person? Is there multiple people that contribute to that? I'd love to understand what that looks like inside the organization.
Yeah, I believe there's no one single person who maintains it. I would see this as a partnership. Yes, there's accountability on the person who's actually building all of these cool AI stuff within the company, which is the AI GTM engineering organization. There is a huge partnership that we have with our data engineering org, who are actually the owners of the data warehouse within a company. Also data governance, data hygiene. There's a lot of component that comes into it. So I see this as a very clear partnership between the AI GTM team, the data engineering, and the data teams, basically the data warehouse and integrations team. So I would see this as a triangulated sort of a partnership, because even for any projects that we do on AI transformation, data is a big component of it, and we spend most of our time making sure that we gain trust from the field or the customer that we are building for, to ensure that we do have the trust in the output that we're producing, and we get a lot of feedback and run a lot of pilots to make sure that component of the program is well sorted through before we do anything. And I think that is the longest sort of effort in any program that we deliver. That takes the biggest amount of time.
Yeah. And is that something that's done as part of the initial strategy work? And then what's the cadence in which you meet to look at how do we evolve this, or what's missing? Or is it part of the AI Council? Do you have a standing monthly meeting cadence? And how does that evolve over time?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I would say AI Council as more of a strategic enterprise-wide initiative where we are bringing in folks across, we call them champions or activators, right, across different functions to one, create a shared understanding of what is happening across each function, are there redundancies that we can avoid by the tool sprawl that's happening with AI, and govern, right? That's another one. What are your programs? How are you looking at the ROI? What are the industry benchmarks that you're looking at? So we have a very strategic conversation at the council level. But when we talk about the program builds, that's a separate part because we want to branch that off from the strategic conversation and make it real tactical so that we have the right working groups talking about critical decisions that we want to be making on the program level. And we run that in sprints, right? So it's typically how we run our GTM R&D org, right? We have sprints. We want to make sure that we have the designer because every AI program has to be thought through in a very different way from an experience standpoint. So we do definitely have a designer to rethink how work happens. We have our customer who we are designing the product for, internal customer. We have our data teams, our Salesforce developers, product managers, and AI engineers. So we assemble a pod and then we bring in guest appearances. If we have a data science person who needs to come in for a certain component of work, we bring them in. So this is the pod. This is like a core team working group that we create, and we meet we create daily stand-ups. We have weekly forums where I join and I try to guide the team and I have an understanding of what's happening and where I can unlock things. And then we report this up on the progress to our leadership team. So we run this in a very sort of a tight collaboration mode with regular touch points because we have a global team and we got to make sure that people feel included and people feel that they're brought in to the context and a shared understanding of the progress of the body of work.
Got it. Okay. So let me kind of summarize here. So I think there's a lot of work early on to make sure that we've got an AI-ready data organization or data model. We've got to have the strategy in place. We've got to have the right stakeholders involved. Then we get to a point where we start thinking about what is the work that we want to actually have the AI run on top of, right? And I was speaking with someone recently who said, just because we can put AI on top of it doesn't mean we should do that, right? We should think about whether or not those processes should even be automated or where should we redesign the work. So in your experience, so what changes in workflows or operating models that become necessary when you think about embedding AI into everyday work?
Yeah, I think this is the most important question because to your point, I think it's really, really important to have a framework of what is AI fiable or what is not AI fiable. Because not everything is a candidate for AI transformation. And that is the mistake a lot of people do in let's AI-fy everything and layer in AI here and there, right? So I want to talk about the difference between what is automation and what is a candidate for AI and how actually things change with AI. So if you think about the automation world, right? So let's say there's a 10-step process where people are working across these 10 steps. And the question you would ask is, what are the pieces of these 10 steps that I can automate? That is very different from how do I transform this workflow with AI? Because you can't ask the same question with AI saying, can I add AI in step number 6? That's not the way you look at AI, in my opinion. It is really, really an opportunity to rethink how work happens. So what I mean by that is, let's take an example of a seller's world, right? It's prospecting. Every company does this. The seller basically goes to multiple places to get different data signals. They assemble it and then they basically figure out a way to go engage with the customer. That's basic prospecting. With AI, if you would do this right, the motion of how a human would interact with the systems is going to change. So basically, the seller's job moves from information gathering to judgment and action because the AI is able to bring that data for you and how the human looks at the data and decides where I am going to be investing my time versus where it's not worth investing my time. So that is the redesign I'm talking about. So when I always keep saying about like an operating model change, you start moving away from your static workflows to event-driven workflows. So a rep comes in every day in the morning. The system is able to, as I said, mention that here are the things that has happened, here are the signals for you, and the human basically acts on those signals, right? So basically it removes all the administrative burden of going into multiple surfaces, and then it's the judgment that the human needs to make on where they should focus the time. And that's why the design of how you would build this experience really matters. And when I say redesigning how work happens, this is exactly what I mean by that.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you about that. I saw that you'd posted about the outbound sales reset that y'all had done. And so I'm glad you went into that and shared an example, because I think it's a very tangible example. So I have a question of maybe the hindsight, right? So looking back at your AI transformation journey thus far, what's one decision that you made and delivered on that maybe outsized the impact, or one mistake that you would avoid having that hindsight if you were starting over today?
Yeah, I think one of the decisions where I was able to create an impact was thinking about where can I find the opportunity that can actually create true business value, right? And to my earlier point on having a very clear framework of what can be AI-fied and what should not be AI-fied. So from there, we put together like a rubric of here are the personas that I want to be going after, because here's where the business challenges exist that I want to solve for. And then putting together, okay, for this persona, here are the jobs to be done, and here are the friction points. From there, you basically start identifying what can I do to rethink how work happens to get this friction point out of their way. So that was the genesis of how we created our prospecting engine at scale, which is having a lot of value at the moment and a lot of adoption within the field, and we're able to report on some of the outcomes that we've delivered for the business. So what my guidance would be for people who are trying to think through this, really put together like a map. It all starts with some capability mapping of who are the personas, how does work happen for these personas, and where are some of the friction points, and then assess, is this a candidate for AI, or could you be solving this through other process improvements, role changes? It has to be looked at a 360 perspective, because I believe technology is not the answer always. We got to first assess if this can be solved otherwise, and then insert technology and AI into the plan. And yeah, so that's the biggest, I would say, impact that we've done with AI.
The part that I want to talk about is the measurement or the impact, right? To go back to where we talked about why a lot of pilots or POCs maybe fail, is that it wasn't able to demonstrate enough of an impact, right? People were measuring the wrong things. They were measuring adoption or chatbot usage, but they weren't looking at how is this actually moving the needle on the outcomes that we're trying to drive. And I know you've got a perspective on that. Can you share more in terms of where do you identify when work that does need to be redesigned, how do we measure that impact beyond some of those simple metrics to ones that actually move the needle?
Yeah, one, I think there's a definite hierarchy here, because when you think about the bottom layer of metrics, you definitely have I call them vanity metric, prompts, weekly active users, adoption, all that is important, but I would put that as tier 3. So I would consider them as useful diagnostics, but they're not ROI, right? Then is the tier 2 metric, which is basically the workflow level metrics, right? Did the account research go from 5 hours per week to 2 hours per week? So it's more around the efficiency gains and a productivity type of a measure. And then I would put tier 1, which is a difficult thing to do. And that's why when you think about you got to have attribution and tracking and reporting very much embedded into the solution design that you would be putting together. That should not be coming as an afterthought. Tier 1 would be the actual business outcomes. Because you're solving for an important problem that the business cares about, it better have some sort of a tie back to the key metrics that you care about as a business. Pipeline, conversion, win rates, churn, CSAT. So that's the way you would start measuring your tier 1. It could be direct impact, or it could be influenced, because we do have something around pipeline influenced by XYZ products that we have built. So that could be another way of reporting it, or it could be incremental, right? Because we've been given X amount of target, we are going to be doing more to supplement that. So it's an incremental number that you can produce with some of the products that we build. A classic example would be a lot of companies are doing this AI SDR, because You have your quotas and targets for inbound pipeline generation number. One of the use cases that we have is if a site visitor comes offline hours when our reps are not around and they want to chat and they want to understand our product, could we deploy an agent that can actually qualify them? So this is basically a number that we would not be generating if we did not have AI. So this is incremental to what we have. So that could be another way of thinking about your ROI for AI. So I look at it in 3 tiers basically. And business KPI would be like my tier 1 metrics. And I know it's hard to get there. So that's why when you, as I said, when you think about the design, definitely factor in attribution tracking and reporting. That way you're able to actually do it when you release the product.
Yeah, love that framing of the different tiers and how to prioritize them and look at them. I have one more question for you before we transition to our lightning round, which is a little bit more fun and just off the cuff, if you will. What's the one question that I haven't asked you about that you think is really important as people think about this transformation? Maybe I have 2 questions. What is the one thing I haven't asked you about? And then the second thing is, what's the one thing that you hope people to take away from this conversation today, or the most actionable thing that they might be able to do come next week?
Yeah, I think the one question that I was hoping you're going to ask for is what does success look like, right? In terms of the executive buy-in. I think most of the times I've seen a lot of the companies that do transformation for the sake of it, but it's super important to have that as a mandate from the top because you're trying to make this work superficially and you're trying to strive for it and you are trying to scream that this is important, but I feel like it should be a nice combination of bottoms up and tops down where you got to have that executive buy-in, support, resources, budget, because this is a program that requires investment. And again, to my earlier point, this cannot be like a side function. You are not going to be able to do full justice to it. It has to be a dedicated organization and run like a function. So for that, you do need that tops down support and hoping every company or most companies will have this in their enterprise company-wide charter. And in our company, we report this to the board on how we are basically running agentification internally. So that is the level that this needs to be talked about if this needs to be seriously implemented and you really want to see the results. So tops down push and support sponsorship is extremely, extremely critical for this to work. To answer the other part of your question, if you don't as a company, I highly recommend that you sit down and talk about what that plan is to make sure that it integrates into both these motions, bottoms up as well as tops down.
Yeah, which I think also probably gets at why maybe these pilots fail, right? They don't have that right executive support. The pilots don't show enough of the movement and what the board or the executives care about, so they lose interest. And lose interest, you lose funding, and so on and so forth. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I 100% agree with that, and that's super, super important for this to be successful. The other question I was hoping for is the build versus buy. As I said,
let's talk about that for sure.
This is the most confusing and interesting topic, and I don't think anybody would have one right answer. It's such a case-to-case sort of a evaluation at the moment. And I think everybody who's doing what I'm doing will agree with that it's probably the most sort of a tricky time that we are in because this is the new era of building with economics being so cheap, with AI being so accessible. But at the same time, how do you strike the balance? Which one should be a build? Which one should be a buy? Where do you build that? And also the roles that are evolving with that, right? Because the technology or GTM technology teams that have historically supported third-party vendor tooling are there. And there are also roles like internal AI builds which have formed. So how do these two organizations collaborate? Where is the line? So that's just been a very interesting sort of a dynamic across many organizations I'm talking to. Yeah, I was very curious that you would be asking me this question.
And I'm glad you brought it up because I do want to talk about it. So what I've heard a lot of folks say is what's unique to our business. That's like the things that we necessarily want to own. And anything that's more plumbing or infrastructure or more horizontal, you kind of got at this a little bit earlier, is like, what is it that we don't want to maintain, right? Because things that we need to maintain, requires work, people leave. So when you think about what it is that we buy versus what it is that we build ourselves, I'd be interested to get your perspective. What are some of those core principles that you look at to make that decision?
Yeah, the way I think about a build versus buy is I really don't want to replicate a very purpose-built tool, which is extremely complex. I probably am never going to build a... However, if there is context that we need to be building, right? And if your point around the foundations, the semantic layer, the context layer, the agentic sort of handoff, governance, how does a human and an agent sort of a graduation happens? How do we maintain all of this? Multi-agent orchestration. That is something that is a very classic case of build. Now, the interesting set of things or capabilities that come in between this blurry area is yesterday, this is a very recent conversation. Yesterday, I was having conversations with my team around how do you mine the insights and intelligence from a CI type of capability, right? The call recording happens. It's all there, the raw transcripts. When you look at some of the vendors out there, all they do is they take the transcripts, they pass it to LLM to get that insights. Obviously, they connect it to other sources of data to create this sort of a revenue context, right? Could we do that internally? Now, interesting question. Yes, maybe, but should we do it? Then we think about what is the cost associated with it of paying vendor a higher bill versus us doing it. And we got to think about the scalability of how many reps do we have? How many tokens should be processed? What is the orchestration cost? So that way we start building in the economic model of a build and a buy. There are a lot of capabilities like that we could potentially replicate, but do we want to do that? Is it cost effective for us? So those are the type of things that we start thinking of. But the other class of tools like Salesforce, we probably don't even want to be thinking of building something like that and buy like an AI native or a Salesforce like CRMs, which can do that. So that's where we start putting in like this gray area of tools. We got to be very cognizant of, do we choose to build or do we choose to actually buy a third party vendor?
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, and the point around like we can probably build it. Do we want to, right? Is it the right use of time? What about the last question, which is around what is the one thing that you hope that either people take away from this or maybe the most actionable thing that they can do next week as they're thinking about AI transformation?
I think one is definitely have a clear framework on what are the use cases that you want to go after for building and why. Have the clear intent, have the clear outcome, have a sizing, opportunity sizing of what you're going to get if you build that. And then who you're serving for is going to be really important. Based on that, you'll have to plan what are the personas that you want to bring very early as design partners. As I said, in the go-to-market world, field readiness is an absolute critical partner for you to start working with very closely. So having that rubric and framework of what are the AI use cases that are absolutely AI-fiable versus not, versus what you should not be AI-fying, that's another sort of a dimension that you got to think of. So jobs to be done, personas, gaps, friction points, and how you would solve for by redesigning the workflow and process. So that framework is going to be extremely critical to start with.
Great. Let's transition. I want to do a couple questions on lightning rounds. First thing that kind of comes to your mind, biggest transformation killer.
Process.
Tell me more about that. Why process?
I just feel like a lot of companies overdo process. For example, if I want a quick change, submit a ticket and somebody needs to look at it, there's an SLA. Just being an impatient person, I have very less appreciation for that. So if you want things to happen quickly, you gotta be doing things quickly, like meaning it's not perfection, it's iteration that I believe in. So let's build something quickly and then make it more perfect. So I don't want process to stand in my way of delivering that perfect result and waiting for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Yeah.
Yep. Got it. What's more important, strategy or execution?
Execution.
Yep. Hardest thing to change. Go ahead.
I was like, me being an operator, I believe in doing stuff and
Yeah. We could talk about it all we want. We got to actually get moving and start seeing results, right?
Yeah. Bias to action is what I truly believe in. Yeah.
What's the hardest thing to change inside a company as part of a transformation like this?
Mindset and culture.
Mindset and culture.
Especially in the age of AI, I believe there's a lot of sensitivity. Is AI going to take my job? So people become detractors in a deliberate way to adopt the things. And I think that is a very difficult change to bring in.
And how do you do that? How do you change mindset?
Yeah, I think it's very important to, one, make them more aware and enable them to adopt to AI, to give that confidence that this is not here to take your job, but it's here to make your job better and make you more efficient. And then I also feel like people should be a little more open-minded to stay more relevant, because there's so much of opportunity for the evolution in terms of the roles to happen in the age of AI, right? If you think about like a core standard administration type of a job, even in RevOps, that's sort of evolved into the GTM engineering type of a function where you become more savvier. So you as a person need to be open-minded to stay relevant so that you can use this as an opportunity to evolve into much more relevant roles, rather than I don't want to change and I don't want any help with AI, I'm going to be stuck here. Those are the roles that probably are going to evolve into something else. So you've got to move with the change. So it's kind of two bi-directional. I would say the companies need to be enabling the employees at all levels to make sure that they can do their job better, and the employees need to evolve to stay more relevant into what are the job functions that they can transition into in the age of AI.
Yeah. Okay, last question for you. Not AI related at all, but when you not busy inside an organization and trying to drive change and drive AI, what is it you like to do? Like, how do you decompress outside of work?
I do a lot of traveling. I have 2 young children, so take them out, travel, spend, it's more of a family time. That's basically where I wear out all my stress.
Yeah, I've got 2 young children as well. And fortunately, work, my daughter's over here waiting for me to talk to me. And I'm like, give me a minute. But yeah, no, I did same thing. Love to spend time with the family. So if someone wants to reach out to you after listening to this episode and get in touch with you, best way to do so?
LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, very active. So feel free to reach out anytime.
Great. Well, Amrutha, thank you so much for your time. I think it was a really insightful episode. You've obviously have a lot of great wisdom. So thank you for sharing that with the audience, and appreciate your time.
And thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Of course. Well, that's another episode of the Revenue Lounge. Thanks so much for everyone listening. Take care.